I stopped in my tracks and a hoiho, yellow-eyed penguin, was on the track. And it wasn't moving. And it was almost like it didn't know I was there. I stopped and I just retreated and I stayed still. It was one of those timeless moments.
Kia ora, and welcome to The Tramping Life, a podcast about hiking in New Zealand, or as we call it here, tramping. I'm Jonty, and in each episode I chat with people who share a passion for exploring this incredible country. We'll hear about the tracks they love, the huts they return to, the lessons they've learned, and what keeps them heading back into the bush. My guest today is Marius Gavalas, tramping guide and author. Marius has spent decades exploring New Zealand's mountains, forests and coasts and sharing that knowledge through guiding, writing and photography. I'm delighted to welcome him to the podcast. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora, Jonty. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of your earliest memories of being outdoors?
I grew up in suburbia in England, in Oxford, about an hour and a half west of London. We always went to Wales to visit my grandmother. And so some of my earliest memories were tramping around Snowdonia. I remember doing the Snowdon horseshoe in my teens and not being able to see a thing, but being really exhilarated by being on a knife edge ridge up there. And then during school times, we went up to the Three Peaks of Yorkshire with the school and did an 11-hour tramp there up Pennygent, Whernside and Scarfell Pike. So I guess those were the seeds of being in the outdoors. But yeah, living in a really densely populated place as southeast England was, never really had the opportunity until after I graduated university. And then I spent several winters in the French Alps, skiing in the winter, but also did a few summer seasons. And I think that was really the main seed for this is me, this is where I want to be. And it was during that time in France that I met my Kiwi partner and came out here with her in the late 90s. And really from day one, when I got to New Zealand, I was like, yep, this is a country for me. And then I really got the bit between my teeth.
Do you remember your first multi-day tramp?
Yeah, it would have been up on the Coromandel Peninsula. We lived in Wanaka for a winter and then moved to Whitianga. And it was at that time that I was totally enamoured by the beautiful landscape. But I didn't have really a lot of tramping experience. And I didn't have really a lot of gear either. I moved over here with literally a backpack and a pair of skis. And so I did a traverse of the Coromandel Ranges, a little bit towards the south. And it was a really eventful day. I was hitchhiking everywhere. We were too poor to even afford a car in those days. I hitchhiked and it took me 4 rides to get to the Wentworth Valley. The first was with a couple of young bros who were driving so fast I was scared witless. And I told them, you've got to pull over. I need to get out of your car. I don't trust your driving. So they left me on the roadside. And then the next woman who picked me up was a woman who she had her 2-year-old daughter, the dog and the cat. And she said, well, last time I left my husband, I left the cat, but this time I'm leaving him for good. And so she had a few stories to tell. And then she took me to another junction where an old farmer dude picked me up. And it wasn't particularly conversational, but he took me to the edge of the Wentworth Valley. And the final ride was a local resident who was telling me about this new lodge that had been built up there. And he was a bit disgruntled because the Riverstone Lodges, as it was called, had taken all these riverstones out of the river and altered the hydrology and causing his land to flood. Anyway, I went up and started my tramp across the ranges. I went to the Wentworth Falls, and it was a mixture of both tramping tracks and just rough old 4-wheel drive routes over the ranges. It was really right on the tops, and there was quite a bit of nav to do. The maps didn't necessarily correlate with what the track network was. And I saw these couple of people, and they were in really shiny shoes and their equipment absolutely immaculate. And my first thought, which I didn't say, was like, oh, you're lost. Anyway, they said hi. And then they stopped me and said, excuse me, we're lost. And I was like, yeah, I can get that. I understand. And I said, are you staying at this Riverstone Lodge? And they said, yep. I said, you need to pay attention because the sun was going down and it was getting late. And they just had a little bottle of water and nothing on their backs. So I said, right, you need to go left. And their eyes just glazed over. And I was like, no, you really need to concentrate on this. And that moment, this black Labrador dog came up. I was like, oh, that's really strange. I said, is this your dog? They said, no, it belongs to the lodge. I said, follow the dog, and left them on their merry way. So anyway, I made it over the ranges, and I still had my tent with me. But I bumped into this farmer, and it was right on the back blocks on the edge of the Coromandel Forest Park. And he was like, oh, mate, come and just have a little sleep out, and come and sleep there. It's a bit rough, but there's a mattress down by the hay. And there's a couple of steaks. Here you go, mate, and away you go. So that was my first overnighter in New Zealand. That really settled for me the beautiful scenery, but also the wonderful people that we have here, and how if you've got a backpack on your back, you're just welcomed wherever you go.
Given how many tracks and well-defined routes there are, that's an interesting kind of first choice.
It stemmed from this idea that I got pretty early on in the piece after moving here. Obviously, growing up in the UK, where there's centuries of habitation, and Oxford as well, being a literary place, there was literally a guidebook for the road that my parents lived on that I grew up on. And here I was in Aotearoa, New Zealand, excited to go out and discover new places. I went into the local bookshop and asked for the guide to the local tramps or walks. And they said, no, sorry, we haven't got it. I said, could you just order it in, please? And they said, no, sorry, you misunderstand. There isn't one. This is 1999, and there's a whole region, and there's not even a guidebook. So I thought I'd better write it. And that was how this whole author career started off. Doc were really good. They gave me a list of all the tracks. But it was very much a mission to then try and walk as many of them as possible through the lens of writing them down and taking photographs to put them into a book. So this Wentworth Valley was part of that greater project.
So that was the first book you published?
Yeah, I guess the seed of the idea had been sown in England that I really enjoyed writing. And geography was what my degree was in, and always had an emotional response to beautiful landscapes. And obviously, moving to Aotearoa, New Zealand, was just a dream come true for me. But I never really had the chance before I got here to be able to write. And then when this idea came forth for a regional guidebook, I did a correspondence course, which wasn't necessarily how to write, but it was more about how to market yourself. And through that, they led me into how to write a proposal. But I figured I had no track record, so I better come up with the goods before I actually tried to find a publisher. So that was where I got hold of Doc, found all the tracks, and I spent about 6 months, weekends off my day job, hiking around the Coromandel Peninsula, thinking about if I was going to be reading this book, what was it that I'd be wanting to know. So obviously the grade of the track and how to get to the start of it, what the interesting features would be, both in terms of the geology and the botany, the fauna, Māori history and European history, and take a few pretty photos along the way with a few contextual introductory chapters. So I got all that material together, and then I realised that Reed Publishing were the main outdoor hiking publishers in the country, and sent them off a proposal. And within 3 weeks, they got back to me and said, yeah, we're keen. And so it was literally the first hit, and it came up with a tick. So I knew I was on the right track.
Excellent. And I guess how many books have you published since then?
Yeah, so after Day Walks of the Coromandel, the first title was called, and I'd done my research and I realised that Mark Pickering was really the tour de force of tramping guidebooks, and I didn't want to really compete with 101 Great Tramps. But walks, I felt, was probably a bigger market as well. Everybody's going to Kathmandu and Macpac and getting lots of outdoor gear and wants to discover the places close by to where they live. Or if they were overseas visitors, they didn't necessarily have the time or the experience to get into the backcountry. So the walks, the criteria was if you could go backwards and forwards in a day, then it could be in the book. And so that was just the idea of this Day Walks concept. And Day Walks of the Coromandel sold its first publishing run of 3,500 copies in 6 months. So Reed were like, yeah, we're going to reprint, and can you do some more? Bay of Plenty and Aotearoa, Northland were the next ones. And they sold really well. And Peter Jansen, who was a publishing manager at the time at Reed, were like, we're going to cover the whole country here, Marius, and get your skates on and do as much as you can. So I gave up the day job, bought a VW Combi, and did a lap of the North Island. Peter Jansen also said to me, I've always had this idea, Marius, a guidebook to the beaches of the North Island would be really good. Do you want to write it? You don't need to ask me twice for that one. So basically spent a year with my partner doing a clockwise loop of the North Island, taking every road on the left, researching this book, but also doing these day walks hikes. And Reed realised that they needed to get in there fast, so they commissioned a few other authors to do some of the South Island and a couple of other North Island regions. But I basically spent a year on the road doing as many walks as I could get in on the very limited budget that we had. And it was a fantastic introduction to the beauty of this country, and really a sort of a dream come true to be able to nibble at the edges of the national parks, but also to start getting some experience about being in the New Zealand backcountry and reading the weather and knowing your gear to take and refining my map skills. There were still some reasonably tricky, rough treks, but it really gave me, I think, the skills and experience that I needed to then develop my tramping skills further.
Do you have any particularly favourite day walks, ones which may not be the obvious kind of Tongariro crossings?
Yeah, difficult question, John. Here, I mean, it's like your kids. You don't have your favourite kid because they're all different in their own ways and you love them, whatever. But I really like Broken Hills, which is just north of the Whangamata turn-off on the eastern side. And it was an introduction to gold mining. And there's a 500-metre long tunnel, the Collins Drive, that goes through there. And heaps of old rusting machinery around the place. And it was introduction to the endeavour of the early pioneers and really just the hard work that they went through to be able to extract the quartz and then crush it all up in really difficult country. And so that for me was not just an entry into the beautiful landscape, but also realising some of the European stories associated with that. So Broken Hills, Coromandel, I really like the Punakaiki area around Pororari as well. And I'm not going to give away the secrets because this was something that I discovered early on when people asked me the same question that you've just asked me, in that I really like that process you go through of meeting the right people or scouting out on the map. And then sometimes even by happenstance, coming through across these beautiful places, and they really have an impact on you in a feeling way. But there's lots to discover around the Punakaiki Pororari area as well. And then I think the other region that has always hit home is down in Fiordland. And that was really the sort of the beginning of my guiding career. Gertrude Saddle, I think, was one day trip that's known, but that was, this is pick of the bunch.
And how's the publishing industry fared since? I know the internet has taken over to some degree.
Yeah, it was a short but sweet career as an author. Between 2001 and 2008, I ended up writing 18 guidebooks. 12 of them were day walks. I wrote a book called Tramping in Fiordland that was published by New Holland. And Reed also commissioned 3 historical guides. They were called Landmarks books. After about 2011, sales really started to tail off significantly. Reed also sold out to Penguin in 2008, and Penguin had a much tighter commercial focus. Reed were really happy to publish books if they felt they were going to contribute to the greater literary heritage of Aotearoa, New Zealand, even if they weren't going to be a commercial success, whereas Penguin were like, if it ain't going to make money, then we're not interested. By the early 2010s, we were all starting to use the internet more, and the information was becoming a lot easier to find. The combination of those 3 factors meant that sales started to tail off. I had a young family, and going away for weeks at a time became less and less viable. So I carried on writing for New Zealand Wilderness Magazine and a few other publications, but that was when the authoring tailed off and I started to become a full-time hiking guide.
How does one become a professional guide?
Yeah, once again, got a funny name, Marius Gavalas. It's a Greek name, and being brought up in England, I speak like a Pom. And what are you doing showing us around this sort of a place? There was a couple of barriers to get over, to, I guess, be accepted. I was fortunate in that before I migrated here, I met Kiwi friends over in France doing ski seasons, and one of these friends' father came over to stay. He's a generation older than myself, but notable botanist with Manaki Whenua down in Dunedin, Peter Johnson, and amazing man, and I guess a walking encyclopedia, and has this amazing knack of being able to bridge academia and hard science to just telling a damn good yarn. And I was privileged to be able to spend many days with him, both on the Coromandel and down in Fiordland, hiking and just listening to him and his interpretation. And so I really sponged up both a lot of knowledge, but also a lot about the style of what interpretation is about. And then obviously researching all these guidebooks, I spent a lot of time in libraries and speaking to local people, and gave me a whole wealth of knowledge. And Peter was instrumental in helping me to get a job on the Hollyford Track. And that was a 3-day, 2 nights guided walk with a couple of lodges, one at the Pike River confluence and the other at Martins Bay. And so I spent a couple of summers running up and down the Hollyford with paying guests, and that was really where I cut my teeth. And everything stemmed from there.
Guiding is a job, so it's quite different to just going tramping for pleasure. There's a lot more kind of things to consider. It's
a privilege to be able to spend your life outdoors in the amazing scenery that these islands have to offer. And I realised pretty early on in my life that sitting down in front of a screen was not for me. And so there'd always been a need to be outside, physically active, and preferably in areas of outstanding natural beauty. And so guiding and authoring were a natural fit for where I wanted to be in my life. But when you're guiding, you're really off service. It's about helping other people to enjoy the place and to give them depth of experience that they might not have otherwise, and also to look after them in a health and safety way. That's your primary objective. When you're in the backcountry, you're really at the service of those people, which means that for yourself, when you want to go on a mission, it actually gives it a bit more zest, because you're like, yeah, it's not like you're free, but you're able to take your time to take the photographs, or to stop and be with a plant, or to sit and have your lunch looking over a landscape and really take your time. So they're very different experiences between guiding and your personal tramping.
Yeah, because I view tramping as a way to switch off, but if you're working, you're switched on the whole time because you're going to be worrying about your guests.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And most of the time you're having a good time with your guests. They're on holiday and they're completely taken by the beauty. And so it's very easy to have fun. But yeah, you're right, you're on. And this was the beauty, is during the summers, I'm trotting around the hills showing people around. But then the downside was that the summertime would obviously be where you'd be doing a lot more of your own personal missions, especially if you're getting above the tree line and bringing up a family. It was difficult to then have more time off in the winter and difficult to get high. But I would always take myself off for at least a week or two over the winter, almost as a sort of a decompression, because it's not just the physical energy that you give out when you're guiding, it's more the social energy. You have to have a really strong social battery to be able to engage with people over a long period of the day. And come the winters, I just actually wanted to be in with myself. And so the tramping I did in the winters was a real decompression and a real time for internalization and a time to really relax. And that's where I find my peace and find my solace, when I'm in the beautiful landscapes of these islands.
In terms of guiding, I'm assuming it's primarily internationals, or are there an increasing number of Kiwis considering it?
The Hollyford was mostly internationals, but a smattering of Kiwis. After that, when we came up to live, I live in the beautiful Motueka Valley. I've been here for the last 15 years. So when we first set up camp here, I spent 7 seasons in the Able Tasman. Once again, the outfit there have a couple of lodges at Torrent Bay. And that was mainly internationals, but especially in the shoulder seasons and the school holidays, you get a lot of Kiwis. And it's great to help New Zealanders discover their own country as well. And it was amazing how often I'd hear people from Auckland or Hamilton or Tauranga come down to this region and say, oh, we travel overseas a lot, but we figured that we should actually see our own backyard first, because I think for a lot of Kiwis, travelling overseas, it gives them value in terms of what we don't have here, maybe in terms of longer human history or majestic archaeological sites. But they also realise that the natural beauty of these islands is unsurpassed anywhere that you go in the world, and the people that you meet on the tracks here and the whole tramping, hiking culture is so friendly that Kiwis really want to experience that. So it's always a pleasure to guide Kiwis, and it's also a pleasure to watch the Kiwis and the international visitors interact, and how the international visitors, especially I'm a French speaker as well, so I spent quite a bit of time guiding Frenchies, and the French are like, when they start having a conversation with a Kiwi, they're like, wow, you guys are really friendly, because they're just not used to that back in France, where everybody's rude, nobody wants to help. And it's great, watching those little sort of cultural idiosyncrasies.
The Able Tasman National Park is beautiful throughout, but are there any particularly special parts of the park to you?
Yes, obviously, 7 seasons, I must have hiked the coastal track, 250 times or something like that. But we always used to, with my fellow guides, go off on little missions ourselves when we had time off. The park's just great because you can explore it by kayak as well, which gives you a completely different perspective. And obviously the coastal track is what gets all the accolades and everybody knows about. But once you start venturing up some of the watersheds up towards the inland track, there is some amazing country through there. So the Torrent River is an absolute beauty, but that's surpassed by the Falls River. So there's a short detour off the main coastal track that takes you up to a couple of swimming holes and small waterfalls. But if you carry on past there, then pretty rough, broken granite country, progress is incredibly slow. But once you weave your way around bluffs and climb up a few faces, you don't need ropes or anything, scramble through the dirt, You get up to an upland plateau, and there you can actually get into the Falls River, and it's only about waist deep. And you can follow that up to a beautiful place called Glennie's Clearing, and there's beaches you can camp on through there. And the missions I've done up through there have been post Project Yanzoon. There's quite a few trapping tracks that have been cut, and that makes your progress a bit faster. And then you can drop down into the Aotearoa watershed and come out onto the beach there. So yeah, some really awesome missions exploring up at the inland areas. And then also I really enjoyed the northern part of the park. So most people were doing the coastal track will finish at Totaranui, which is as far as the boat transport gets. But north there up towards Anapai and Mutton Cove, Separation Point, and then the loops around there, around Gibbs Hill. There's quite a few little hidden spots. There's a lot to offer in Abel Tasman beyond the coastal track.
I'm always a bit envious of living around the area because you've also got relatively easy access into Nelson Lakes National Park and to Karangashi National Park.
Yeah, that's right. Obviously, Nelson Lakes, you're really getting into proper mountains there. And Karangashi, it's funny. Look at the peaks of Te Whawharepapa, Mount Arthur, and the Te Whawharepapa Range. And once again, Karangashi has such variety, and being our second largest national park, I've not even begun to explore Karangashi in depth, even though I've lived here for so long. Yeah, I feel really privileged that literally with them on my doorstep is more tramping than I could ever do. And in fact, now my kids are older and fled the nest, and I've got more time with my partner now to go off and explore the hills. I climbed Mount Owen with her back in the autumn, and that was just outstanding. What a country, just so otherworldly. The limestone karst up there and how deeply weathered, and the erosion and the route finding that you have to do to be able to avoid the little crevasses through there, and the razor sharp nature of the rock and that softness that you get from a limestone geology. It was just beautiful. And we'd have breakfast at home, and then dinner time we're up at Granity Hut.
Your living situation is a bit different to most. I think you talked about living in a yurt for some time.
Yeah, I've never really been one for houses, and I guess this is part of this as a tramper. We spend so much time under canvas, and we all, I think, have that real connection that you feel when you're just a thin layer of canvas between you and the natural world, and the humidity that you're able to sense, and the bird call in the morning, and the rustle of the leaves, all those wonderful warming experiences that we have in a tent when we're tramping. When it came to setting up a bit of land, we bought 2 acres of bare dirt. It had some mature trees on it, and a hazelnut orchard and some chestnuts and walnuts. We had some ready planted trees, but otherwise it was just a paddock. We were looking to set up somewhere where we could just walk around in bare feet and feel like we were connected to nature. And I had a friend who was building yurts at the time, and he said, why don't you have a go at doing one legally, trying to put it through council? So we did. And we got all the sign off. And so for 11 years while the children were growing up, we lived in 50 square metres. It was a glorified tent, had insulation and a elm floor and beautiful furniture throughout. But it was a really warm, cosy, comfortable space with a log fire. But once again, you could hear the birds first thing in the morning, and we had a domed skylight at the apex of the roof. So you could lie in bed and watch the moon traverse over, and you could watch kahu fly over in the mornings. And it just always makes me feel like my need to get into the hills, I feel, is less, because I have so much of what I enjoy in the hills here at home as well.
And now you're building a tiny home on wheels?
Yeah, very early on after migrating to Aotearoa, I was working as a builder on the Coromandel. And there was one day I was going out to a job, and I drove past this dock campground behind a Pito Bay, and I was mesmerised. I saw this beautiful Mercedes truck dripping in chrome, shiny black, and this huge home on the back that was all batten, LED light windows, and a little chimney coming out the top. So on the way back, I knocked on the door. I said, sorry to disturb, but I've just got to tell you that this is the most beautiful home I've ever seen in my life. I just wanted to say thank you. And anyway, they invited me in, and 3 hours later, I'd heard all about their life stories and how they'd built it. And that really sowed the seed for wanting to build my own truck. Never really got round to it. I converted my own bus when the kids were young. We lived in the bus down in now for a year and a half. Then we sold that and then bought this bit of land. But that dream of building and living in a truck had always stayed with me. I wrote an article for New Zealand Geographic magazine on the Gypsy Fair, which is a sort of a caravan of travelling market, and that really reinforced the beauty of being itinerant. Which trampers and hikers, it is that joy and sheer pleasure of discovering new places. The process of being able to go through a map before you go away and think, oh, what would that be like? And then expediting that, and then that sort of integration feeling you have after having been there, and you're going through your memories and your photos and your journals. And so that being an itinerant, I think that notion's changed quite a lot, certainly since the late 90s when I migrated here, where there was a lot more physical space and I think a lot more social space. I think New Zealand's become a bit of a victim of its own success in terms of how many tourists and the style of travel that they have, especially with the camper van market. And so I think it's a lot harder now to be able to find those out of the way places, to be able to park up and chuck your fishing rod in a river or take a little walk. And so that sort of dream of living in a house truck and moving around has slid out. But the idea of living in the aesthetics of a truck has stayed with me. And that's why I have the time and the energy and the skills finally building the truck of my dreams, which is going to replace the yurt and hopefully be a home see me through.
The kids are grown up now, so you can, in terms of space, are you trying to have enough space for kids and adults or just for the adults?
When I tell people I'm downscaling from a 50 square metre yurt to a 24 square metre house truck, there, God, you're crazy, Marius. But yeah, and I really think this is one of the things that I've learned through spending thousands of days in the front and back country is I think we all love that minimalism that we feel when we're in the hills of being self-reliant with just what's on your back. And I've always wanted to try and translate that as close as possible to my living circumstances as well. I love a warm fire and I love cooking up a big feast for friends and family. And I'm not saying that we want to remove ourselves from the creature comforts, but in terms of having a smaller impact on Mother Earth and living in ways that keep us closer to nature, I think it's really important. And yeah, I really feel privileged that I've finally found my tūranga here in the Motueka Valley.
They've obviously done some hiking overseas, and even though we share the same accent, I didn't start tramping until I got to New Zealand. I've never been up Snowdonia. What's the closest to Snowdonia from a New Zealand perspective?
Oh, it's funny. I think Snowdonia only just about tops 1,000 metres in altitude, which I think the Coromandel and the highest peaks in Mount Moaho is just under 1,000. Mount Aotearoa was the same. But I think anywhere in Aotearoa, you've got to go through some forest first to be able to get that sort of altitude, whereas everywhere in England, I think all the native forest in England had been chopped down by the time of Henry VIII. So I was just back there recently in Lake District with my family over there and hardly a tree to be seen. And we're walking up Old Man Coniston. So I think it's very difficult to find these comparisons. I think our landscape here is so unique. And this is a comment that's often repeated by international visitors, is that not only is our landscape aesthetically beautiful, but we have this lush forest that cloaks the whole landscape. So I think that has been my main teacher from early days in Snowdonia to now exploring these islands, is that developing a relationship with the forest. So that's really where I feel my love is now lying.
And our wildlife is obviously unique as well. Have you had any memorable encounters?
Yes, yeah. I think this is something that's come to the fore the longer I've been tramping, is that when I was younger, I was obviously fitter, and I think we all tend to walk faster and do more when we're younger. And now in my 50s, I'm still active, but slowing down and taking the time to appreciate my surroundings more. And I think when you do that, you're really able to get on the same resonance as the wildlife, and especially with the birds. So I'll always remember an encounter with the New Zealand falcon walking through. It was like a little tree tunnel in the Hollyford. And it was one of the few times I actually walked the Hollyford myself rather than with guests. Once again, slowing down. I didn't see Kariadia, but I just felt this. I couldn't even feel the wind. I almost felt the energy of it passing, and it would have been within an arm's distance for me. And it just alighted on this branch a couple of meters up. And we eyeballed each other for I don't know how long. But that was such a deep, memorable connection. I think it cemented it as my spirit animal. Another experience was researching one of my books of the Wairarapa, and I'd gone to Castle Point, photographed the lighthouse there at sunset. As I was walking back, I stopped in my tracks, and a hoiho, yellow-eyed penguin, was on the track. And it wasn't moving, and it was almost like it didn't know I was there. And so I stopped, I just retreated and I stayed still. Once again, it was one of those timeless moments. I realised that this hoi-ho was probably towards the end of its life, whether it was going blind or quite what. But anyway, it was like, okay, I'm going to walk around you rather than you scuttle off. It was a privilege to spend so much time in such proximity to what is otherwise a very shy creature.
Amazing. What's left on your tramping bucket list?
Yeah, once again, living so close to Kaharang, really want to start exploring in more depth now. I've got more time on my hands, and I really want to walk my skyline. Tuao Wharepapa, Mount Arthur, is the main peak of the Wharepapa range, and you can then, from the Flora car park, you can either go to Tuao Wharepapa or you can then head north towards Lodestone, and then Crusader, which is a sort of a flat top peak, which is quite prominent on the skyline that you see from Whakatu Nelson, and then goes over Hoary Head to Mount Campbell. So that's the skyline that I see from home. And my daughter she's got that skyline tattooed on her foot. So it's her tūranga way. So we're going to walk that together, hopefully over this summer. But by extension, the Tuao Wharepapa range, if you carry on south, goes over the Twins and the Batten Saddle all the way to Mount Gomorrah and Mount Sodom, like really evocative names. But then you can also head north from Mount Campbell and you can go over Haley's Knob and actually get into the Abel Tasman and follow a ridge there all the way down to Anapai Bay. I'd really love to do the whole extended walk one day as well. But yeah, just an example of the depth that's open to us here just within Kaharangi and in really close proximity.
How long do you think that would take?
I haven't researched it in enough detail to know, but I think the longer hike would be maybe 9 days. But once again, it'd be good though. I'd be able to, because there's road access at Flora Saddle, be able to have a food drop there.
So it's quite doable, and that's, I think connecting up the different tracks and routes and a bit of off-route, you can turn those kind of 2, 3, 4 day tramp, here's your description, into some pretty epic adventures.
That's right, and I think this is one of the joys of having so much country open to us as New Zealanders, is that we're not tied just to the tracks, although the tracks and the routes are amazing, and they're amazing with good reason, and we should definitely be getting out there and doing those. But we also have the opportunity to be able to read our maps and just dream and see, if I link this together, link that together, and now obviously with so much valuable material of people who've shared their experiences on the internet, we can start to get some pretty good information to keep us safe as well, and know, is that river going to be crossable, and am I going to get bluffed here even though the contours look like it can happen? There are all these sort of little tricky pinch points that we can work out. Yeah, this is one of the joys, just being able to get lost in a map and put together these routes.
Wonderful. Good luck with that trip, and thank you so much for your time today.
I really appreciate what you're doing here with your Tramping Life podcast. I think it's really important that in this day and age, the solace and the peace that we feel when we're outdoors and slowing down to the rhythms of nature is really important to keep us all sane and together. Appreciate what you do for that culture, Jonty. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to The Tramping Life. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow the podcast in whatever app you use. Tell a friend about it and consider leaving a rating or a review. It really helps more people discover the show. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email at thetrampinglife, one word, @gmail.com.